If y'all don't know who I am, I'm Tony Martin from Elmore, Alabama. Probably the most common thing I am asked is, how does a person from Alabama get interested in Kenworth trucks? We did not get Kenworth trucks in the South until about 1960. In 1973, my dad bought a new K123, and he was the type guy that wanted to know everything about whatever he was doing at the time. So he already had a good friend who was a mechanic who'd become service manager at the new Kenworth dealer that opened in Montgomery, Alabama, 1972, Mr. Clarence Lucas. Those two they were Kenworth people. My dad wouldn't own anything else but a Kenworth pretty much once he bought that K100. I was around them from the time I was born. I was fortunate to be good friends with Mr. Lucas throughout my career when I was old enough to even know what was going on, and he knew I was interested in trucks, and that just tickled him, so he would tell me whatever I wanted to know about them. And then I made an acquaintance with Mr. Clay Blackwell. His father, H.C., started the second Kenworth dealership east of the Mississippi River in 1960. Thankfully, the Blackwell family were essentially pack rats. So I became friends with Clay, his son. Their dealership closed in 1977. All of the records and books and just junk, as they called it, that were stuffed around, I was able to plunder through that. I've collected Kenworth materials other places for numbers of years, probably 25 years now, 30. So I've amassed quite a bit of materials and literature, and I just particularly like the W900. So we're gonna talk about those today. Here in part one, we're going to start at the beginning and we're going to run through 1972. If you don't know, that's when the paddle style door latches started. And then after this, we'll do part two and we'll cover the 73 models on up through the beginning of the W900B. So we'll get started here. Throughout the 40s and 50s, the main Kenworth model was the 500, 800 series. That actually referred to the chassis design. They used a straight frame rail. You can see here on the left, that is a 500 series. Got the tow hook sitting above the bumper because that's actually where the frame's at. The bumper is mounted under the frame. Approximately 1956, they introduced the model 900. And the big thing with the 900 is it had a drop section on the front of the frame so they could fit a larger radiator. For a bigger engine, you obviously need more cooling capacity, and engines were getting larger and larger, so that was a solution. They dropped the front of the frame down. As you can see, the tow hook is actually in the bumper now, and that's indicative of it having a drop section front. But that was why it was called a 900, because it had a drop frame. And here you can see the 900 frame on the top with the actual molded on drop section in the frame rails that are molded to drop it down. And on the right, you see the 500, 800 series, which was actually straight along the bottom rail, and then the top rail tapered a little bit to fit the engine in and fit as big of a radiator as they could, but not nearly as much space as the drop front allowed. So in 1960, for the 900 series, one of the improvements they came up with was the tilting fiberglass hood, known as unit glass for unitized design, unitized fiberglass. It was easy to tilt and get to the engine to work on it. It was lightweight. As you can see, they're showing these two mechanics picking one up, holding it. And that was quite a revolution at the time. It changed the looks of the truck, and it also made it much easier to service. In approximately 1962, horsepower was steadily going up, and a larger radiator needed to be installed. They couldn't go any lower, they couldn't go any higher, so they went wider. and you see they came up with the wide grill version. Some of the 335s that went to the south or areas where it was kind of warm all the time would get a wide grill, severe service type trucks. Some of the ones with 380 Cummins would get the wide grill. But those were fairly uncommon, but you started seeing them around 61, 62. So with the chassis pretty well worked out, the tilt hood worked out, the next place they started to improve was on the cab. And 1963, during the summer of 63, they built a completely new cab out of aluminum and fiberglass. And since it was 4 inches taller and 4 inches wider, much more roomy, they called it the W cab for wide. So when you put a W cab on a 900 chassis, you have a W900. The original truck, serial number 1, was fitted with a 1673 Caterpillar, 5 and 4 Spicer boxes, had a torsion bar suspension and aluminum frame. It was actually built as a day cab. In the Kenworth promotional pictures, you'll often see it as a day cab here. But before it was sold to Linden Transfer for essentially testing, they put a used 900 series sleeper on it for running back and forth to Alaska. And so as you see it here on the lower left corner, that's actually the first new W900 with a used 900 sleeper on it. That's the way it left the factory. We often hear of a W925, a 921. What does that mean? Throughout all of, up until this point of Kenworth's truck production, the suffix on the model number indicated the chassis type. The numerical part was the frame type, and then the suffix of the numerical part indicated the suspension axle type that it had. 921 was a single axle, 922 was a single axle with a tag axle essentially, or a pusher axle, single drive with a dead axle anyway. 923 is on, don't know how it missed the notification, but it's actually right here with the air ride set up. 923 was any vendor supplied suspension or any other suspension that was not a torsion bar with 38,000 pound axles was a 923. So air ride, KW 4-spring, Rayco, Hendrickson, whatever was a 923. 924 used heavier rear axles, and that was typically SSHD Rockwell, which was a 44,000 pound, or 44 Eatons. And then the 925 was 38,000 pound with torsion bar. Regardless of anything else about the truck, if it had torsion bar, it was a 925. The rest of the truck were all the same. Everything was the same on them except the suspension and the axles that denoted what the model number was. So on the inside of the new W900 cab, you see the instrument panels were set out from the dash panel a little bit here. That was to provide a little more access for your wiring and plumbing and what have you go into your gauges. You can see here in truck number 1, the heat start switch for the Caterpillar engine for the glow plugs. It had a tachograph and a speedograph in it. And then here on the right, you can see kind of how Spartan the inside of the cab was laid out. And then here on the lower right corner, the early original cabs had a solid smooth firewall. That's very indicative of the 185, 190 series cab. 185 was a day cab, 190 was the sleeper cab. And I'll refer to various cabs by their assembly numbers. It's easier to keep track that way. But the first generation W900 cab was the 185 and 190. It's not really that well known, but at the same time that the W900 was introduced, they built another conventional. and it was put on the 100 series tapered frame that we later knew as the K100. At that time, they were calling it the COE 100, but they actually built a conventional. I had this brochure here for probably 20 or 25 years and couldn't figure out why there was a steering box mounted up on the front and just what exactly I was looking at until a couple of years ago. I was writing an article for the Wheels of Time magazine, and I was looking at this picture and discovered that frame doesn't have a drop section on the front. It's tapered. And with that little piece of information, I started digging and found quite a bit of information that proves that the model 100 or W100 did exist. Truck number one, cab number one exists today and is in a very good hands in a collection. But you can see this particular truck had a 1693 Caterpillar in it, TA, and they set the cab back 12 inches to fit the engine in. And initially I thought maybe all of the W100s were this way, but they were not. Here are a couple more. Up on the top side, there's one from North Carolina. You can see the slot, the tow hook slot in the bumper, and you can see the very thin spacer panel under the cab. The one on the lower right was actually used in the Caterpillar 1693 sales brochure advertising their engine in 1964. But you can see the skinny filler panel between the cab and the tank, and that's because there was a tapered frame there, not a straight frame as a W900 would have with the normal thicker filler panel. And then of course you can see the K100 style tow hook on the front. Here on the left, you'll see how they're advertising this 100 series frame as being tapered to fit a new V8, higher horsepower V8 type engines. At the time, Caterpillar had the 1676 that was about to come out. Cummins was promoting their VT, I believe they were 350 horsepower engines. There was another version that was 430 horsepower. At the time, everybody thought the wave of the future was going to be the V8 type engine, and unfortunately we know that didn't work out, but to better fit a V8 type engine, they thought this tapered chassis was going to be the way to go. So they built the W100s to fit that engine in. In fact, all of the 100s that I have been able to verify so far through chassis records either had a V8 type engine or a 1693 Caterpillar. Here's another one that's, you can see a little closer. It had the little panel on the right side that actually fit like the toolbox did. The standard extended cal W900 did not have that. This is unique to the W100. And then here on the right, you can see that it has the K100 style tow hook. And this particular truck was ordered by McCoy Caterpillar in Denver, Colorado. They actually supplied the 1693 TA to Kenworth to install in this truck. And it was used for their lowboy tractor for a few years, one of their lowboy tractors. But it was actually a narrow grill. As I'm sure others existed, but this is the only picture I've been able to find of a narrow grill 100 series with the extended cal. The W900 later received the extended cal to be able to fit larger engines in. As you can see, it's just essentially a steel extension panel riveted to the front lip on the firewall where your hood would normally rest. The earliest one I've been able to find is this one here on the right, which was delivered 6/17 in 1965, had a 12 V71, 5 and 4 spicers, and planetary rear axles. This truck still exists. I can't remember where it originally came from, but it's in Vermont now. But this was the original style 185 series cab, and this has got the original wide hood on it, the A146-544 hood, which is a standard length hood, wide grille. And they only had to do with this with the 12V71, 1693, and then the 1676 V8. I have been able to find a couple of those that had automatic transmissions, and they needed the extra space to fit the heat exchangers for the automatic transmission. So initially, we talked about the first W900 having a used 900 series sleeper on it. Well, obviously the W series cab was 4 inches taller, so they aligned the roof caps of the sleeper in the cab, and at the bottom there's kind of a staggered body line here. So they just simply raised the mounts up enough so the roof lines would equal out. And they were built this way through February 1965, and they actually extended the sides of the sleeper down 4 inches so it would match the bottom of the cab and the top of the cab, lowered the mounts, and this new sleeper was known as RO67-205. Had the ripple back pattern, which served to strengthen it because there were no braces inside. And we typically see them with solid one-piece doors on each side, but you could get split doors for bunk and toolbox on the left, on the right, or on both sides. The parts book actually tells you how to cut the panels down if you've got a short sleeper, to cut 4 inches off of them to fit the short sleeper. It also tells you how to take a solid door and cut it to make the split doors if you've in fact got a split door sleeper. So sleepers were still kind of in their infancy of options and how they were producing them. March 1966, there was a change that really means a lot today, but the original W900 used this multi-piece casting here on the front to attach the hood, the radiator, the front of the spring, the bumper. Everything was kind of attached there together and had several castings. Well, the W100 is no longer a thing now, so they beefed up this area, and in doing that, it became the W900A. It used a one-piece casting. Kenworth called it a drive bracket. That's where your spring attached, the front of the frame attached there, your bumper, your motor mount, front motor mount, your radiator mount, all right there together in a much heavier duty casting. This was typically aluminum as opposed to steel, but you do see some cast iron ones. This picture here on the right shows a center-mounted tow hook actually with a 35-inch bumper setting. The drive brackets still had the sockets for the normal style tow hooks, but if you specified a 35-inch bumper setting, standard bumper setting was 30 inches by the way, but if you specified a 35-inch bumper setting, you got the center-mounted tow hook and a little heavier duty bumper. But the change from W900 to W900A had absolutely nothing to do with the cab or anything else. It was simply this frame change right here. So typically Kenworth liked to change their model numbers when they did something to the chassis. They'd switch the cabs all around and nothing really happened with the model number, but the frame really meant something, so that was when this change occurred. So March 1966, remember that date. And here from the front, whenever they changed these castings, you can see how the bumper matting changed. From any sort of a front view in a picture, you can see if your center bolts, your inner bolts for the bumper mounting are up midways of the tow hook sockets, that's the original W900. You could get an 8-inch bumper or a 12-inch bumper in those, aluminum or steel. When the W900A change came about, they moved those bolts down to the bottom. That actually attaches to your lower radiator mount. And since everything is kind of moved down with that new casting, the drive casting, your bolts moved down as well. And when we went to the W900A, they split the difference and just offered a 10-inch bumper. And again, in aluminum or steel, either one. Your W900 also, plain W900 also had this little tread plate piece for a step right here on top of the bumper, which was eliminated when you got to the W900. You don't see Don't see that step piece on bumpers with the inner bolts mounted lower down. So earlier, whenever we went to the W900A, that was in March of 1966. So from March 66 to September 66, there were W900As built with the original cab style. Took them a few months to come up with a new cab. The new cab was an RO67-220. This is the second generation. If you notice, it now has a riveted in recess in the firewall. By that time, they had decided V8 engines probably were not going to be the way to go from Caterpillar and Cummins. So they made an easy way to put an 855 inline six Cummins in, and that was that recess riveted into the firewall. Another easy way to spot one of these cabs, if it has a spotlight, is the spotlight sits straight out. When it's mounted, it sits straight out. On the early style cabs, it sits up at an angle. That's because the roof cap was changed, and the original roof cap was more rounding. This one had more straight sides, and then the top was rounding. That's a little hard to see unless you have seen a lot of them or else see two side by side. But if it's got a spotlight, it's very obvious to spot the difference in those. But that's the 220 cab. On the inside, we received this little pod-mounted tach and speedometer, and from 66 through 67, these panels were beaded aluminum. In 68 and the first part of 69, they went to a wood grain trim. Late 68, early 69, right before they changed cab styles again, they actually went to the flat speedometer tachometer panel for just a short time. So there's quite a few variations in dashes with this, with the new cab, the second generation cab. You basically have to identify it from the outside, and then from the inside you can pick out pretty much what year model it is. And when I say year model, let me clarify that. Kenworth didn't produce any year models. They changed things when they got ready to, and the year model is actually based on when it was sold. When I say year model, I'm referring to the date it was built. So this cab started production in September 1966. Some of these trucks may not have been sold until 1967, so they'd be titled 67s, but in fact they were built in 66. When I say 66, I'm referring to the build date, not necessarily when they were actually registered. But this is second generation cab. 1968, we've got a marker light on the side of the hood. The Highway Administration decided that all heavy trucks needed standards for clearance lights, and there needed to be a light on the front corner of the truck. Kenworth decided to mount a Dietz Model 58A amber marking light here on the side of the hood, and it had a 2-inch reflector with it. That's the beginning of 1968. A bit of confusion exists with the Signalstat 1301A. Later, that became standard. That was the parking light after 1971. However, all the way back to 1965, that was available as a $10 option. So this truck here in the picture was built during 1966, but you can see it has the Signalstat lights down there on the above the headlight, and that was a $10 option. They called them parking lights, and after the required light on the side of the hood appeared, you actually would see trucks that had both the Signalstat above the headlight, the Dietz on the side of the hood. So, February 1968, we received a little bit of a revised hood. The original hood had this chrome strip down the middle, and it also had a recess on the right fender for the air cleaner so it would clear when it was tilted, when the hood was tilted. February 1968, we received the familiar V formation in the top of the hood, the molding, and that was actually created for strength and to make producing the hood a little bit simpler. And the model numbers were a K146-630 for the narrow hood, K146-623 for the wide grille, And this particular hood design continues all the way through the end of production. And that's February 1968 when the hood was redesigned. Notice there's a difference in those two emblems, and we're about to talk about that. But this is February 1968. In October 1968, the emblem was redesigned. Initially, they retained the old design emblem, which had larger font and a slightly different design on the outside. But importantly, it had two grab handles, one on either side of the emblem for tilting the hood. They retained those with the new style hood for a couple of months, and in October 1968, they came up with this new logo, and they called it a hood pull because it incorporated a molded handle into the emblem so you could tilt the hood, eliminated the need for the grab handles on either side. Mounting holes were the same. Sometimes you'd see an earlier hood updated with one of these. Nowadays, it's popular to put one of the older style emblems on. The bolt patterns are all the same, they interchange. It's because of the overlap in when the hood changed and when the emblems changed. So initially we talked about the original W900 and the extended cowl. Those are quite unusual. But when the W900A came about, that was going to be their conventional. The W100 is gone, and they're full bore building the W900A. They're quite popular, but they needed to be able to fit larger engines in. 1693 Caterpillar, 12V71 Detroit. So same idea that they had before. We put the extension on the front of the cowl, the steel piece riveted to the cowl of the cab, and use the same standard length hood. We know them today as extended cowls. Kenworth referred to that simply as cab move back 12 inches from standard position. Been a whole lot easier just to call it an extended cowl, but at the time they didn't. I have taken various 100 truck blocks and looked at serial numbers throughout the late 66 to April 69 time period, and roughly 3% of all W900s were extended cowls through that period, meaning they had a 1693 either T or TA, or they had the 12V71. And you can see here we got some variations. Lower left corner, 2 exhaust, single breather. In the center, 1 exhaust, 1 breather. This truck most likely had a hydraulic retarder on it because you could only get a single exhaust with the brake saver, Caterpillar brake saver. Lower left corner, 12V71, it needed to breathe as much air as it could get, so it's got dual breathers and dual 4-inch exhaust. Just some identifying features of those. The top's factory picture from early 1968. You can see it's got the marker light on the side of the hood, and this is most likely going to be a log truck because, as you can see, the fuel tank on the right side is the smaller 22-inch diameter, and it is raised up, mounted as, they call that a high mount tank. They raised it for ground clearance, so the pipe had to come around the back of the tank and turn up. We know this truck had a 1693 in it because there is no muffler to be seen anywhere. Through 1971, mufflers were optional equipment if your engine had a turbocharger. So 335 Cummins, 1693, 270 Cummins, all came standard with straight pipes, no mufflers. And here we talked about the engines that required the cab move back 12 inches, but you can kind of see what the pricing was. This is November 18th, 1968. A 12V71, 404 horsepower was an extra $7,000. At that time, a new W900 base model was roughly $22,000. Cost an extra $7,000 to get a 12V71. Go down to the bargain of a 1693T of only $3,060 extra, or they could put an aftercooler on it for you and give you an extra 60 horsepower for $5,760. All that is going to change before too long. April 1969, we got the third generation of the W900 cab. And this time, they came up with the idea to mount the mirror arms to the cab. You could still get them on the doors, but you had the option to get it on the cab as well. That reduced vibration, helped extend the life of the mirrors, helped extend the life of the doors. On the top, it received two little moldings in the fiberglass that was a place to mount your horn. Prior to that point, you had to have a spacer and a special bracket to hold the front of your Grover air horn. They molded that spot into the cab on this third generation cab, which by the way we'll refer to as a 239 cab. Its assembly number was RO67-239. Lots of things going on with this cab at this time. You received a one-piece back panel. Prior to this, on the 220 and on the 185 as well, the back panel of the cab was three pieces. You had a left corner, a right corner, and a center section. Seems like a good idea, so you can change it out if you want to switch to a day cab or a sleeper. Unfortunately, that was a place for leaks to happen, so to eliminate the leaks, Kenworth eliminated the seam. They made that panel one piece. At the same time, they lowered the windshield mask, which the fiberglass piece is the roof cap, and it comes down the windshield post, and it forms your cowl, and it comes all the way down here. This is known as the windshield mask. This was all one piece. It was brought down lower, again, to eliminate a seam that was there on the earlier cab and try to eliminate possible leaks of rainwater coming in. And it appeared to work pretty good because these cabs, this essential basic design stayed in production for many, many years. At the same time, the riveted in firewall, which took extra man hours and labor to put it in, they developed a way to actually stamp it into the firewall whenever they stamped it, and you no longer have the seam for the indention of the doghouse. They also received these hood locating pins at the bottom, the rubber pin that actually mounted to the cab to locate your hood instead of the pads that were up on the top. So it rested up here and it had little scuff plates here on the side where it rested on the sides. Initially, they had a alignment pin, but they weren't mounted to the cab. That was on the original W900. With the second generation, they eliminated that. With the third generation, they went back to it in a slightly different form. Another important thing, particularly for the driver with this cab, is the positionable defroster vent. This was done for a reason. The earlier cabs simply had a little vent that blew onto the windshield. Didn't have air conditioning then. Air conditioning was in the roof. So the only thing you wanted to do with a heater was defrost that windshield or blow down on your feet. So there was no need to be able to move that vent. With the 239 cab, they introduced the combo air conditioning system, which was located below the dash on the right-hand side. And when you needed a heater defroster, you pointed them towards the windshield, and when you were ready for an air conditioner, you changed the switch setting, turned the vent around, and you had air conditioner blowing on you. It was actually installed there instead of in the roof. You could still get it in the roof. The Frigiking and various other types, Kaiser, they would install on the roof for you, but they also offered this one, and within a few months, when people started really understanding what was going on with this setup, it was rare to see a roof mount air conditioner. Early on, there were quite a few. They kept putting the roof mounts on, but once this idea caught on, that's what they continued doing. At the same time, this entire dash structure, the metal part, was painted with a black vinyl paint. In the past, they had painted it either black or some sort of coordinating interior color, but it was simply enamel. This was, I believe they called it a vinyl rich paint, but it's kind of a thick, like a soft paint, semi-gloss black, and they painted the entire dash housing with that to cut down on glare and make it a little easier to clean. At the same time that the cab came out, the 239 cab, they were still building the ripple back sleepers with either one or two piece doors on either side. They also came out with a new sleeper, which was the RO67-243 in April 1969 to match the new cab. And at this time, they received a separate toolbox and bunk access door on both sides. That was the only option you had. You couldn't eliminate a door, you couldn't have a one-piece door. This was it. They also moved the latch down to just the toolbox door, and if you wanted to open the bunk door, you had to reach inside and pull a little cable that would open the bunk door. So one lock, one latch, and you were secure. With the old style door, if you did have split doors, each one had a latch on it. So that's more cost for 4 latches, more keys to keep up with, and that was eliminated, and an easy way to identify them, even if it's got split doors. The new sleeper has got this little bar here that separates the lower door from the upper door. The old style sleeper, even with split doors, does not have that. They simply shut against each other, or beside each other rather. So, easy way to spot a new style sleeper. If it's not on a truck, you can tell what it fits. So, with the new cab, remember that was April 1969, they kept putting the extended cowl on it whenever you needed a 12V71 or a 1693. It took them a couple of more months to come up with the idea of eliminating that cowl piece and simply molding a one-piece longer hood. So September 1969, the K146-669 long, wide hood is what they called it. It was always available only as a wide grille, and it was 12 inches longer than the standard hood. Very easy to detect one of these because it's got the 12-inch flat panel right behind the fender extending back to the battery box. These are, it'll replace the extended cowl, but why would you want to? But these hoods they retain the original mounting design. They didn't use the rubber pin at the bottom. They used the original pad that sat on the top of the firewall to support the hood with a brace panel down at the bottom. You can barely see it here in this picture. It's got a brace panel out from the frame, which contacted a spot on the hood, make it come down correctly. And this design was September 1969. January 1971, a relatively small change greatly impacted the trucking industry, engine manufacturers, and a lot of different things. The 1693 was not particularly popular anywhere except the West Coast because it required the long, or as they called it, the cab moved back 12 inches. East of the Rocky Mountains, the length laws required short trucks, and that foot of length for the hood meant a lot. So you'd have to really, really want a 1693 to order one with that extra foot of length. January 1971, they came up with the idea of a deep recessed fiberglass doghouse to allow that 1693 to fit in a standard hood. You can see here on the right, you've got a shallow indentation on the standard W900 cab, but here on the left, we've got the deep recess for a 1693. There's a bolted-on access panel here in the middle where you could access your camshaft drive, and that allowed you to disconnect the camshafts and get the head off with the engine and cab still in place on the truck, which had been an issue if you tried to fit it in a standard hood without this recess. So, by being able to fit the 1693 in a standard hood truck, everybody across the country could have a 1693 and not have to compromise their length. And prior to January 71, roughly 1 in 50 trucks had a 1693. By January 1972, that number was pretty close to 40% of W900s had 1693s. And that was the issue. As soon as you could get it to fit in that short hood, their popularity skyrocketed, and the race was on between them and Cummins and Detroit to an extent of who could have the most powerful engine and so on and so forth through the 70s. We'll talk about that more in part 2. So the last big change that we're going to talk about here for this part is the 1972 changes. They received this paddle style door latch. It's more than just a door latch. On the inside, it received a striker pin with a unitized latch here, an automotive style latch to latch around that striker pin. Previously, there had been a brass wedge with a mating piece on the door that your door would shut against. Not a lot of room for adjustment. A lot of wear took place and you'd have to replace them. This was supposed to be a more secure design and a easier to replace design. Apparently it was, because they still make a version of that today. In doing that, it came up with the paddle style door latches, which again were made for many, many years. And at the same time, they redesigned the top of the door with a new top seal and integrated handle. And in doing that, they narrowed up the width of the wing window or the vent window. So all of these changes basically occurred to the door and the actual door frame itself, and that denoted a new cab, the RO67-276. And this is basically the last change to the cab. 276 cabs made it all the way through 1982 at the end of production, and basically unchanged. But that all occurred the very end of December 1971. Their intention, again, not producing year models, their intention was trucks that would be on the lot for the 1972 year model would have these. And I've run across a handful that had this style door that were built between right around Christmas of 1971. So obviously they were going ahead and getting the change implemented for the new model year coming up. So with that, I've reached the end of my slide. No, actually I haven't. No, I haven't. What's wrong with me? We got to talk about the other conventionals they made. The sister trucks. The W900 S2 was a short bumper to back of cab, BBC. For primarily the East Coast, it was also popular in other areas where you needed intercity delivery truck, or maybe a truck used a lot on the yard or in tight spaces. They had a really short bumper to back of cab dimension, and in doing that, they were limited to a V6 or V8 type engine. The air cleaner was under the hood. As you can see, it very nicely had the cap to the air cleaner on top of the hood. I'm sure that was really pleasant for the driver trying to look over to the right side, but with the hood that short, where else are you going to put it? So most you saw in the north central part of the country, Minnesota, Wisconsin seemed to received a good many S2s, and then in the Northeast. And they were started essentially in 67, maybe a few in late 66, but essentially 67, and in early 1973 they were discontinued. Another version was the S12, W900 S12. It had the same dimension from the grille to the back of the cab as the standard W900, but the front axle was moved back. That gave you more weight on your steering axle for states that had higher ratings, higher weight limits on the steer. It also made it a little bit easier to maneuver these trucks because you could effectively have a shorter wheelbase. But the important advantage to the S12 over the S2 is you could pretty much have any engine that was in the W900 in the S12 version as well, except of course the 1693 and 12E71, which required the cab to be set back. You really saw these mainly in the eastern United States, but it is not uncommon to find them sprinkled everywhere else around. They were a little bit behind the S2 in introduction. They came out in 1968. They were built at least through the end of production in 1982. I've seen a few 82 models. So this was you'll hear them called a setback front axle W900. At the same time, this is the series. It's a W900 S2 series. This truck here on the left with the air ride suspension, it'll be a W923 S2. The one on the right, you can't tell it in this picture, but in other pictures it's got a torsion bar. So that's a W925 S12. You continued the suffix. This was the series, and the individual model number included the suffix. Kenworth also produced trucks for the construction market, and that's where it's kind of confusing because they were trying to cover all their bases. The C800 S2, you notice the familiar very short S2 hood, but the difference with the C800 is it used a variable rate chassis. It's an 800 series, so we know it does not have a drop front that the 900 would have. So the front of the frame tapers down, and this made it particularly popular for mounting front drive mixer drives, PTO for a mixer drive. You saw these as mixer trucks, dump trucks. Another identifying feature on a C800 series is it had a fish belly frame. Not only did the front taper, but once you got just ahead of the tandem, it dropped down, and this is actually the bottom of the frame here. This section is almost 15 inches tall that ran up under the cab, and bodybuilders will know that the area at the back of the cab for a mixer truck, dump truck, any sort of straight truck is the highest stress area on that chassis. So they hope to solve that issue with the fish belly frame on the C800 series and keeping the front straight. But this also limited the engines that you could get. So it's give and take. So if you wanted a larger engine, then you could get a C900 S12 or C900 S2. Let's talk about it first. Uses the same chassis as the S12 does, and it uses a straight frame with a drop section just like a W900 would have. Engine options were limited just like the W900 S2 series was. But this truck had heavier steering axle options, heavier brackets. They typically use steel where the W900 would use aluminum. And it was just a beefier truck that was marketed towards construction markets. By the same token, the S12, same basic chassis, just had a longer hood, same length hood as the standard W900, but it was a setback axle. We're going to talk about what happened when you needed a construction version of a W900 on the next slide. But these were the popular, marketed towards the construction market conventionals that Kenworth produced through 1972. 1972, all this changed. The standard length hood, standard front axle position trucks, they marketed towards logging. On the left, you have the LW900, which was built in Canada. You saw a lot of them in the United States. They used a fiberglass fender with a aluminum or steel butterfly style hood. As I say, they were built in Canada for our market. They were sold over here. You see a good many of these in our part of the country. And the Seattle-built version was called the L900. In later years, Kenworth produced a W900L, and there's often a lot of confusion with this model here, but the L900 was a logger version of the 900. Anytime Kenworth produced a variation in these years, they like to put a different model number on it for reference, and this is one of those cases. The L900 had a different set of standard specs and a different list price than the W900. Even though this looks exactly like a W900, once you tilt the hood and look underneath, you most likely won't find any aluminum parts. Everything will be steel, and the standard suspension and rear axle was actually a Rockwell 55,000 pound, I believe it was a SUDD tandem with a heavy, I believe they called it a Timken Kenworth Temkin rear suspension was standard. Saw a lot of them with SSHDs as well. When the advantages were learned about this truck, one particular advantage, they became rather popular, and that was that it was actually an off-road truck. Kenworth considered it to be an off-road truck. And at that time, in the mid-60s, federal excise tax did not apply to off-road equipment. It applied to on-road trucks. Many people bought a L900 series when they needed a heavy W900 to avoid paying federal excise tax because it was exempt. In our part of the country, there were hundreds of these sold for coal hauling. Nowhere near the woods for logging, they haul coal, but they were L900s because they already came with all the heavy specs and didn't have to pay federal excise tax on it. And now we've actually reached the end of part one with the slides that I have for this.